Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Tzadik Hey Amud Beis, 5 lines from the bottom. Previously, the Gemara taught us a statement from Rava, Chamesh Midois Bekli Cheres, that depending on the size of the hole, it's a different status for the Kli Cheres. Beginning with the smallest type of hole, where it causes a leak from the water to then leak out. A bigger hole still is when water would enter from the outside. Still a bigger hole, the size of a small sharesh. Bigger than that is a hole that a olive will fall through, and still bigger than that would be a hole that a pomegranate would fall through. Rava concludes his statement that a kli that was designated for pomegranates loses its status to be mekabel tzuma when it has a size of a hole greater than that pomegranate. However, he says if it still has what's called a tzamid psil, it has a sealed cover, then even though it's underneath maybe an oil hames, and normally a kli cheres, which is opened, all of the things that are in the airspace of the kli cheres will become tamei, but if it has the tzamid psil, it will protect the contents from becoming tamei. And Rava said that so long as that the majority of this kli cheres does not become broken off. Says the Gemara, Omer Rav Asi, Shomati kli cheres shi'uroi kemoitzi rimoin. Rav Asi says, I heard that a kli cheres, meaning an average kli cheres, loses its status from being mekabel tuma only when it has a hole greater than the size of a rimon, whereby a pomegranate will fall through it. Now that's not what Rava said, because Rava said an average kli is, if it has a hole greater than the size of an olive, will lose the status of mekabel tuma, unless that kli was then designated for holding on to pomegranates. Then, only if it has a hole larger than the pomegranate will lose its status of mekabel tuma. So, Rava wants to correct Rav Asi, and he says to him, Omar le Rava shema lo shamata ela b'mukaf tzamid psil. Maybe you only heard this being said in regards to the halacha mukaf tzamid psil. That means that if a hole is greater, we said, than the size of a pomegranate, so it's true it loses its status to be mekabel tuma, even though it was designated for holding pomegranates, but it still will then protect the contents from becoming tamei if it's in an oil hames. Maybe that's what you meant to say, but not to say that loses status of mekabel tuma if it's a regular classical kli cheres. Ask the Gemara, v'harava hu da amar mukav tzamid psil ad sheyivchas ruboy. But Rava himself said that it still will protect the contents of the kli cheres if it's underneath an oil hames, as long as it has a tzamid psil, as long as the majority of the kli does not become broken off, which is much greater type of shear than a bigger hole than a rimon, than a pomegranate. So why did Rava say to him, you might have heard that maybe it's in regards to the mukav tzamid psil, that the size of the rimon, bigger than a rimon, that would then lose its ability to save the contents from becoming tamei. Answers the Gemara lo kasha, it's not a contradiction within Rava, because if we explain it as follows, that tzadik vav on the Amud Aleph on the top, we're saying ha berav ravi ha bezutri, because Rava in the original statement that said it has to be the majority of the kli that's broken off to then lose its ability to then protect the contents becoming tamei, that's talking about a large kli. But that which he just said now, in regards to then if it has a size of a hole greater than the size of a pomegranate, that's in regards to a smaller kli. Omar Rav Asi said, Shoinin kli cheres shi'uroi bekoines mashke. Rav Asi says they teach that in regards to a kli cheres, if it has the size of a hole that liquid could enter from the outside, so then he says it doesn't lose its status to mekabel tuma. When did they say the smaller hole, that if it causes a leak, that will lose its status from being mekabel tuma? That's talking about a gistra, a shard. When it was already a shard and then it gets such a hole, even though it's a very small hole that causes a leak, nonetheless it loses its status to be Makabel Tumah. But if it was a Kli Sholem and then it gets such a hole that it causes a leak, it doesn't lose its status to be Makabel Tumah. Ask the Gemara, my time, what's the reason for this differentiation between a shard and a Kli Sholem? Answers the Gemara, Omar Marzutu B'Rei Rav Nachman Lefi She'ein Oimrim Have Gistra Legistra. When a person has a shard and it then gets a hole, even the size that will cause a leak, he's not going to say to somebody, bring me a shard to catch the leak. He's not going to do that, because what's the advantage of then saving the original shard by bringing another shard? He prefer to then discard the shard. But if you have a Kli Sholem that gets such a small hole that causes a leak, then he'll say, bring me a shard to then receive the droppings of the leak. That way he can still then salvage the Kli. So therefore, then we say the Kli is still a viable Kli and it's not Makabel Tumah. In regards to the shard, however, then we say it loses its status to Makabel Tumah. Says the Gemara, Vaiter Amar Ula Pligi Botrei Amoroi B'Ma'arova. There is a machloikis between two sages in the west referring to Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yossi bar Avin, Rabbi Yossi bar Zavdo. Chad Omar Kimoitzi Rimon. What are they arguing about, first of all? They're arguing about what size hole do you have to have in a flower pot to lose the status that it's going to then no longer be able to be makshir the zroim. We know that when it comes to makshir zroim, we said last time that to be makshir zroim, first of all, of course, it has to be detached from the ground. And I'm not talking about only seeds, whether it's fruit or tavua, the produce has to be detached from the ground. Then, if it then has a liquid that falls on it, then it's susceptible to Kabel Tumah. So therefore, if let's say a sheretz were to touch it, then it will become the zroim. So what size flower pot, what size hole of the flower pot does it cause it to then lose the status of being detached, and then it's considered to be now attached to the ground, part of the ground, whereby it no longer then will be something that's susceptible to tumah. Says the Gemara, Chad Omar b'moitzi rimon. One says the highest, the biggest type of shear, when it's a hole that's bigger than the size of a rimon. V'chad Omar kisharesh kotam. Whereas the other one says the smallest type of shear, that is the size of a hole of a small root. V'simonach echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamid. And the simon to remember this is that one says the largest shear and the other says the smallest shear. As it says, one who gives the greater amount and one who gives the smaller amount. In other words, when it comes to the 5 midos that we said, b'shem rava, the first 2 midos are not nogeh to be machshirei zroim. That for sure nobody argues about. Over here, there's only a machlokes about whether it's the smallest shear of the size of a small root, or a middle type of shear, which is the size that is greater than an aleph, or the biggest shear that is the size of a hole that's greater than a rimoin. So here there's a machlokes between the two of them, the smallest shear and the biggest shear, and therefore we remember that machlokes based on saying echad hamarbe, the greatest type of shear, ve'echad hamami, the smallest type of shear. Says the Gemara, Vayter Rav Chinana bar Kahana mishmei de Rabbi Eliezer, in regards to a kli cheres. Kli cheres shiuroi kemoitzi zesim. It still retains its status of mekabel tumah, so long as it doesn't have a hole that is greater than the size of a zayis. Umar kashisha b'rei derova mesayim bo mishmei Rabbi Eliezer. He concluded in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, v'harei hein kekli galolim v'kli avonim v'kli adama she'ein mekabelin tumah lo midivrei Torah v'lo midivrei sofrim. And these are like the klelim that are made out of klolim, which is manure, and the kelim that are made out of stone, and the kelim that are made out of clay, that are not mekabel tumah, not midir rabbona, not midir raisa. Now, this statement over here that we're saying is not in line with what we learned before. In other words, here we're saying that a kli always loses its status of being mekabel tumah if it has a hole greater than the size of a zayis. Whereas Rava said differently. Rava said it's true if it's a regular kli cheres, it will lose the status of being Makabel Tumah if it has a size greater than the Zayis. However, if you designate it for a Rimon, then it has to have a hole greater than the size of a pomegranate. And if it doesn't, then it's still going to the Makabel Tumah. So this is a different opinion that we saw before. Ule'inyan samid psil ad sheyivchos rubo. And in regards to then the sealed cover on a kli cheres, it will protect the contents from becoming tamei if it was in an oil hames until the majority of that kli cheres was broken off. Hadron aloch hamatzniya. The Gemara now brings the next parak, which deals again with Meleches Hoitzah. We know when it comes to Meleches Hoitzah, there are 4 different Rishuyos, really 2 Rishuyos that are Diraisa. Let's discuss those 2 Rishuyos again. The first Rishus is a Rishus of Rishus HaYochid. Rishus HaYochid has the dimensions where it's at least Arba by Arba Amos. Arba by Arba Tfachim. And it has the walls, at least 3 walls surrounding it, that are going to be 10 Tfachim tall. And that Rishus HaYachid will go up all the way into the sky. The Rishus HaRabim is defined, however, as being that which is 16 amos wide. And therefore we're talking about a public thoroughfare that doesn't have walls and it also doesn't have any roof, or a public marketplace. Those would be examples of a Rishus HaRabim. Midiaraisa, therefore, in the Melecha of Hoitzah, one exchanges and goes from a Rishus HaYachid and makes an Akira from Rishus HaYachid and brings it to the Rishus HaRabim by making Hanacha there, or vice versa. Our Mishnah now adds another facet. Hazorek, Rishus HaYachid, Rishus HaRabim. If a person throws an object from the Rishus HaYachid to the Rishus HaRabim, or vice versa, from Rishus HaRabim to the Rishus HaYachid, Chayav, he's going to be Chayav, as a tolda of Meleches Hoitzah. Because here, unlike what we said, when a person picks up an object and carries it to the Rishus HaRabim and puts it down, here we're talking about where he throws it from the Rishus HaYachid to the Rishus HaRabim. So it's a tolda of Meleches Hoitzah, and it's Chayav Chatos if he does so b'shogeg. The Mishnah goes on to say, Mirishus HaYachid l'Rishus HaYachid, Rishus HaRabim be'emtza. If a person throws an object from Rishus HaYachid to another Rishus HaYachid, and in between is a Rishus HaRabim. Now, another dimension of Rishus HaRabim that we didn't mention is that up until Asara Tfachim is a Rishus HaRabim. Higher than that is already called a Makom Petur, it's not a Rishus HaRabim. So let's say a person throws an object from the Rishus HaYachid through the Rishus HaRabim, within Asara Tfachim, into another Rishus HaYachid. So Machloikis, Rabbi Akiva Mechayev. Rabbi Akiva says that even though it doesn't land in the Rishus HaRabim, but we have a concept of Kluto Kamisha Huncha. That which is coming in the airspace is as if it landed, in this case, in the Rishus HaRabim. And therefore, he's going to be Chayev Chatos. However, the question is, why isn't, according to Rabbi Akiva, a second Chiyuv Chatos? Hare, if he does consider to be that he landed in the Rishus HaRabim, then it should also be there's now an Akira from the Rishus HaRabim now going into the Rishus HaYachid. But we learn on Dav Dalam and Beis that the Gemara says that indeed Rabbi Akiva holds that because you don't have a space of Dalid al Dalid that it's landing on, in regards to Hanacha, that's okay. We're not makbid about that. Therefore, Rabbi Akiva says there's a good Hanacha to Mechayiv a Korban Chatos for this Malach of Hoitzah. But to say that there's an Akira now from that Rishus HaRabim, that wouldn't be then sufficient if it doesn't have Dalid al Dalid. Al Kopanim, Rabbi Akiva says this concept of Kluta Kamushe Huncha, and therefore Chayiv. The Chachamim Poichim, whereas the Chachamim say no, as long as the object that you threw from the Rishus HaYachid does not land in the Rishus HaRabim, he will not be Chayiv for Malachas Hoitzah. Ketzad, now the Mishnah now illustrates, according to the opinion of the Chachamim, the following. Shtei gezusterois zu keneged zu. If a person has a gezustera is a merpeses, and he has, let's say, there's a building like this, and there's a merpeses that jets out from the building, and then parallel across, the Rishus HaRabim is another building, and that also has a merpeses that jets out, and both merpeses is considered to be a Rishus HaYachid, and in between is the Rishus HaRabim. So he throws from a merpeset across the Rishus HaRabim, we're talking about within Asar Tzvachim, and then into the Rishus HaYachid, into the other merpeset. So it says over here, Shtei gezus rois, zu keneged zu, b'Rishus HaRabim, hamoishit v'hazorek, means either hamoishit or hazorek, mizu lezu, potter. He will be potter according to the Chachamim. However, in a different case where you had on the same side, let's say you had a similar case where you had a building with two mirpesets, one coming out one way and then coming out parallel to that with some Rishus HaRabim in between. So there, if one throws from one Rishus HaYachid, meaning one mirpeset, to another mirpeset with a Rishus HaRabim in between, so here it's a different din. Here the Chacham would agree it'd be chayev if he would then be moishit. Says the Gemara, Hayishtein b'dyutya achas, the way we just explained, it was on the same side and the same height, let's say, and he were to then moishit, he would then pass from one merpeset to another merpeset. In between was the Rishus HaRabim. He would be chayiv, even according to the Chachamim. The hazorek potter. However, if he would throw it, it would be potter. Why? Why the distinction? Because shekach haisa avodas halavim. Because the avodas halavim was such when they dismantled the crushing of the Mishkan, so then they would have two pairs of agolos. Then they would take the beams from the Mishkan, they would put it on the two agolos that are behind, and then they would then fill up the two agolos in front of them, and therefore it was being moishit from the agola to an agola on the same side, and that was what was done in the Mishkan. Again, shekach haisa avodas halavim shetei agola zu achar zu. There are two pairs of agolos, one in front of the other, or one behind the other. Birshus harabim. And it was a Rishus HaRabim that would go, it was in between the two agolos. Moshitim HaKroshim, they would pass over the Kroshim from the back agolos to the front agolos, but each one to its agola that was on its same side. Mizu lezu, avaloi zorkin, and they would not throw it, and therefore we have a precedent for being moshitin from Rishus HaYachid to another Rishus HaYachid with a Rishus HaRabim in between, if it's on the same side. But we do not have a precedent for throwing because they didn't throw the Kroshim that they dismantled from the Mishkan onto the Agolos.